Now, before we start adding and subtracting these, let's talk about how do you find that least common denominator. So the question here on for learning objective B, this first one says, if I wanted to bring together, and I don't know if I'm going to add or subtract, they haven't told me yet and it doesn't matter. If I bring together 1 over 6x and 1 over 8x cubed, what is their common denominator? And here's the easiest way to do it. And I'll just put on here the least common denominator. To help us put it together, take a look at the x's. This has a single x, this has 3. They have to have the same number of x's. So the minimal number of x's both of them can have is 3, because this one already has 3. So my least common denominator is going to have an x cubed in it. Now number-wise, what is the smallest number 6 and 8 could both make through multiplication? It should be 24. So 24 is that. Now I will tell you, if you don't see that it's 24, because 6 times 4 is 24, 8 times 3 is 24, on our problems in this section, you can just multiply the 6 by 8 and get a common denominator. It may not be the least common denominator. You'll have to do a little more work at the end of the problem, but you can do that. Okay. So this would be the least common denominator. And let me show you how we make it then. So if I said make the common denominator of 6x, make it look like 24x cubed. What would you have to do to 6x to make it look like 24 and x cubed? Well, you'd have to multiply it by a 4, and you would need another x squared. Okay. For this one that's 8x cubed, it needs to be 24, so we know that would have to be multiplied by 3, and it needs an x cubed, which it already has. So the only adjustment you'd have to make to the second one is to multiply it by 3 to make it look like this least common denominator. And that's what we'll do when we get into the next learning objective. Let's look at letter B. The least common denominator between these two. Remember, this is a binomial, so that's one group. This is another binomial. That's another group. When the two groups are completely different, the easiest way to make the least common denominator is take each group from each fraction and just make one big group from it. So I'm going to take this and say my least common denominator would be a combination of 2x minus 4 and 3x plus 9. That's what the bottoms of my fractions should look like. So how do you make the bottom of this fraction look like this? Well, it's missing the 3x plus 9, so I'd multiply it by 3x plus 9. What is the bottom of this fraction missing? Well, it's missing the 2x minus 4, so I'd multiply it by 2x minus 4, and that would be the least common denominator. Both of the bottoms of the fractions now look identical, and then you can do some work in learning objective C on it. Let's look at this last slide and do some more practice. Number 4, the least common denominator, if I look at it, we have a 3x on this first one, and we have a 9x squared. So we need the same number, and we need the same number of x's. So number-wise, 3 and 9 have in common a 9, so I can make them both a 9. How many x's? This has x squared, there's 2 of them. This has x to the first, there's 1. It means I have to have, this one has x squared, so they both have to have x squared at the least. So my least common denominator would be x squared. Well, can I make them both look like 9x squared? Sure. This one already is 9x squared, it's done. The only difference I'd have to do is on this one, I'd have to multiply it by a 3, and I'd have to give it another x. And that would make the denominators look the same. Now for number 5, the least common denominator, this binomial is a group, and this one's a group too. The easiest way to find what they look like is to do this. When you have something that is like an x squared that can be factored, factor this guy and see what it looks like. If I factor this, x squared minus 4 can be factored into x minus 2 and x plus 2. Now what you compare is you look at this denominator and this denominator, and they have to look identical. They almost do. The least common denominator, they both have an x minus 2. This one has an x plus 2. So I can make them looking identical if I just multiply this guy by an x plus 2. If I do, then these two would be the same. So in this case, the least common denominator is a combination of x minus 2 and x plus 2. The last one here, we have our group of 2x plus 1, and then we have a group over here, top group there and a bottom group here. As of now, that and that is completely different. The only way to make them look identical is to the 2x plus 1, give it x plus 1. So I'd multiply this by x plus 1. To the x plus 1, it needs to have 2x plus 1. So I'd multiply this by 2x plus 1. So the least common denominator on this one is a combination of both. It's going to be 2x plus 1 and x plus 1.